Hey everyone, my name is Nathan. Welcome to Hail. So in the month of August, I had no plans to do this, but I ended up reading 4 Alfred Hitchcock books. After I read the first one, I was looking through my collection and I saw a second one and I was like, I'll read that too. And then it came to a point where I was like, I'm just gonna keep reading Alfred Hitchcock books until the month ends. First book I read was Psycho. Everyone has heard of Psycho, the movie at least. I don't know how many people have actually read the book, but just a fair warning, if you haven't seen the movie or read the book, have any of you read the book? I will be spoiling the plot, so just skip to this part of the video. This book was really enjoyable, very well written. I mean, obviously I knew the twist going into it because I've seen the movie so many times in my life. Knowing the twist, there are a few things that I picked up on while I was reading. Like for an example, on page 31, it talks about how Mary wants to take a bath and she says, but when she came back, she promised herself a good hot shower. I put a little note that says emphasis on the good because we know what happens in the shower. I also liked a certain part in the book when it's talking about how after the fact of Mary's death, Norman is looking for his mother and he goes into her bedroom. First off, it mentions how the bedroom was empty, so that makes sense because if you're reading it for the first time, you're probably wondering where's mother, but when you know the twist, you know exactly where mother is. So Norman says one of her dresses and a headscarf were balled up on the floor. He stopped to retrieve them, then shivered in revulsion as he noted the dark reddish stains of clotted blood. She'd come back here, then come back, changed her clothes, and gone off once more, which has a whole different meaning when you know the twist. Yes, of course she changed her clothes. She changed her clothes back into Norman's, so really crazy right there. There's one really cool part in the book where Norman and his mother are arguing because the police have started suspecting Norman, or at least something going on at the motel with Mary missing and everything. And mother, she says something about how the police will come back and she says, $40,000, that's a lot of money. Why didn't you tell me about it? That's like a little foreshadowing, I feel like, about how Norman is mother, because how would she have known that it was $40,000? There's not one point in the book where he mentions to her that the girl had $40,000. And so it's a little hint that she finds that out because they're the same person, so of course they both know. It's just like something little that I thought was really cool. There are some differences between this book and the movie that I'm going to go over. For one, Norman Bates' character is not a young, attractive looking man. He's actually an older guy. He's balding, a little overweight, and in addition to that, he has an alcohol problem. So that was interesting. It also talks about a third personality that the movie doesn't really mention too much. So in reference to the 3 personalities that the book talks about, it says Bates was now a multiple personality with at least 3 facets. There was Norman, the little boy who needed his mother and hated anything or anyone who came between him and her. Then Norma, the mother, who could not be allowed to die. The third aspect might be called Normal, the adult Norman Bates who had to go through the daily routine of living and conceal the existence of the other personalities from the world. Of course, the 3 weren't entirely distinct entities and each contained elements of the other. Dr. Steiner called it an unholy trinity. I love that nickname, the Unholy Trinity. I'm very impressed that the author is able to write a character such as Mother and make her seem so lively, yet the entire story she's dead. This book also provides more information as to why Marion, or well, I guess in this book it's actually Mary, so that's another difference within itself. It explains why Mary wants to steal the money, and I feel like they provide more of an explanation. Another difference between the book and the movie is that in the book, she's not only stabbed to death, her head is also cut off, so I'm glad they didn't include that in the movie. Also in the book, Mother kills Arbogast with a razor and not with a knife, so little difference in death right there. And then there's also other differences with characters. For an example, Sam and Lila are the ones who explain Norman's condition at the end of the book. They don't have like a psychiatrist come in out of nowhere and explain the plot to the viewers of the movie. So little differences here and there. I ended up giving the book 4.5 out of 5 stars. And I think the only reason it doesn't get a 5 out of 5 is because I'm so used to the movie that I've biasly fallen in love with it. And I think that the way the movie opens up showing Marion right away is a much better way than the way this book opens up with focusing on Norman. I think it's a lot scarier and just like more eerie to see Norman for the first time when Marion actually gets to Bates Motel, and that's what happens in the movie. That's not what happens in the book. So little things like that. I just prefer the movie to the book. However, the fact that the movie is based on the book, I mean, for crying out loud, on the front cover right here, it says Psycho all came from Robert Bloch's book. Alfred Hitchcock. So the fact that the movie's inspired by the book, I am very appreciative of this book. After having read the book Psycho, I didn't actually watch the movie because I saw it earlier this year, but I did read the book Psycho, the classic thriller by Janet Leigh, and now this is all about her experience filming Psycho. Any fan of Psycho will really enjoy this book because Janet Leigh breaks down her experience on set, her experience working with Alfred Hitchcock specifically and Anthony Perkins, but she also confirms or denies rumors that have been around for years. filmmakers. And so it was really cool. I had answers to questions that I had, so I really enjoyed the read. First off, the book talks about how Janet Leigh was discovered, how she used to work at a resort and someone famous in Hollywood was actually visiting, and Janet Leigh's father had her picture hanging up in the back office, and the Hollywood star saw it and instantly thought that she was made for Hollywood, and so she referred Janet Leigh's picture to a few filmmakers, and long story short, Janet Leigh becomes famous. So that's a really cool story to me. When it comes to her experience with working with Alfred Hitchcock, she says he couldn't have been more considerate or thoughtful or respectful or agreeable or companionable. Even his detractors never doubted his genius as a filmmaker. I cannot think of a single complaint I could legitimately raise. I was already established in my profession when I worked with him. I was not under contract to Mr. Hitchcock. I like how she calls him Mr. Hitchcock. That's really respectful. So he was not in control of my career. I was married and we had socialized together with our spouses. That to me is completely referencing Tippi Hedren's experience with Alfred Hitchcock, because she didn't have a career in movies and she wasn't married at the time, and so Alfred Hitchcock felt like he had more possession over her. But with Janet Leigh, she was already married, she was already an established Hollywood star, and so he didn't feel like he could control her as much. And then Janet Leigh says, to sum up, I tasted one of the most delicious adventures of my 49 years in Hollywood, which I thought was really cool. Something new that I learned is that the shower scene was actually filmed during Christmas time. It was on December 17th through December 23rd. It was a week-long shoot, which is crazy because the shower scene lasts less than like 2 minutes. Janet Leigh says how during the day I was in the throes of being stabbed to death, and at night I was wrapping presents from Santa Claus for the children and hubby and family and friends. And it's just like so crazy to think. It puts a whole new perspective on that sequence, that while she was filming that scene, later on in the day she was at home wrapping presents for Christmas. Complete opposite. Janet Leigh also talks about a lot of symbolism in Psycho that I had never even noticed, which I thought was really cool. She says how Marion had decided to go back to Phoenix, come clean, and take the consequences. So when she stepped into the tub, it was as if she were stepping into the baptismal waters. The spray beating down on her was purifying the corruption from her mind, purging the evil from her soul. She was like a virgin again, tranquil, at peace, which kind of makes the scene that much more depressing and sad, because she had decided to go back to Phoenix and right her wrongs, and a shower was her way of cleaning off her sin, and then she gets brutally murdered. There's a rumor that goes around that Alfred Hitchcock put cold water in the shower to just make it more and more shocking for Janet Leigh. She says Mr. Hitchcock did not turn on the cold water to get a shocked reaction from me when Mother came in. I was able to do that all by myself, thank you very much. In fact, he was adamant about the water temperature being very comfortable. There's a lot more symbolism mentioned in this book, but I'm not going to go through it. I just recommend you read this book and find out for yourself, because there's a whole 2 or 3 pages just about all the little things that connect and why certain things were the way they were. I gave this book a 5 out of 5 because I love Psycho so much, and so learning the behind the scenes and whatnot was just really interesting to me. Next up, I read Who Was Alfred Hitchcock, which is definitely more geared to a younger audience. Some takeaways: I really appreciated the illustrations. It was cool to see illustrations again. I'm not used to that. And on top of that, I did learn some new facts. I feel like every biography of sorts with Alfred Hitchcock mentions the story of when he was a child and how his father sent him to the police, and from that day on, him being in the jail cell for like 5 minutes or whatever it was like the most traumatizing experience he had ever had up to that point in his life, and the rest of his life he was scared of cops. That story I feel like is repeated in like every single thing I read up on about Hitchcock, and of course it was mentioned here as well. Not too much to say about this one. It's a very fast read. It was enjoyable to learn some new things, but for the most part I kind of already knew everything. Now we've come to the moment you've all been waiting for, my review of Hitchcock by Truffaut. Now, if you're not aware, this book is a set of interviews that François Truffaut, the movie director, most notably known for The 400 Blows, I would say, he sat down and just interviewed Alfred Hitchcock on all the movies that he created, that he directed in his career, I should say. Some movies are several pages long where they just talk about the movie and the process of filming it, whereas other movies, Alfred Hitchcock just says, I don't want to talk about that movie, let's move on. And François Truffaut is just like, yeah, fair enough, let's move on. I consider this like a textbook for Alfred Hitchcock. So if you're really wanting to learn the Master of Suspense and his techniques in filming, this is the book that I recommend you read. Because it is in an interview format, I really love this book because there's no guessing. I mean, all the facts that you read, you know that they actually came from Alfred Hitchcock's mouth. And so you don't have to be reading a biography and wonder, how did the biographer know that that was true? Or like, is that really true? Is that really how it happened? You don't have to wonder that at any point because Alfred Hitchcock is being interviewed, so all the answers are from him himself. One of the coolest things about this book is that it's not a one-time read, and I don't know the next time I'll actually read it cover to cover. However, I do know that I will be referring to this book many times throughout the next few years. Just today, I was watching the Hitchcock film Under Capricorn for Ingrid Bergman's birthday. I had already read the part, but I wanted to reread the section where he talks about that movie because it just doesn't feel like an Alfred Hitchcock movie. So I wanted to read what he said about it. And sure enough, he went into detail about the process of making it, why he made it in the first place. And it's just very enlightening and very detailed on the movies that he's made. And so I know that I will be referring to this book plenty of more times in the future. A few quick cons about the book. The picture quality is awful. A lot of the pictures are really bad quality, and the only reason I know what's happening in them is because they're pictures from movie scenes, and so I know how the movie scene goes. But I didn't like that. And also, there's one page where the words were completely cut off, and that was obviously a printing issue. But I want to talk a little bit about what I learned from this book, and so get comfortable, we're going to talk. A lot of people wonder why Alfred Hitchcock makes cameos in his movies. On page 49, we actually read about why he makes the cameos. Alfred Hitchcock says it was strictly utilitarian. We had to fill the screen, and so that was the initial reason for why he made a cameo in his movie, because he just needed more extras. Later on, it became a superstition and eventually a gag. But by now, it's a rather troublesome gag, and I'm very careful to show up in the first 5 minutes so as to let the people look at the rest of the movie with no further distraction. It's interesting because there are a lot of good filmmaking techniques in this book. However, I'm not a filmmaker. I'm going into healthcare administration, and I'm very passionate about that field. But for someone who's a fan of movies and someone who likes making YouTube videos, I was able to apply some things that I learned to how I want to make videos in the future on this channel. He says, when we tell a story in cinema, we should resort to dialogue only when it's impossible to do otherwise. I always try first to tell a story in a cinematic way through a succession of shots and bits of film in between. And he also references how in the silent era, that was true cinema because you're showing what is happening rather than telling the audience what is happening. And so that just kind of spoke to me about how I need to show my viewers what I'm referring to much more than just tell them what I'm talking about. Another thing that I've learned to apply to my YouTube channel is something that Hitchcock says on page 85. He says, I have learned to be very self-critical, to step back and take a second look, and never to embark on a project unless there's an inner feeling of comfort about it, a conviction that something good will come of it. There's a lot of videos that I want to create, and there are even scripts that I've written, but I've never actually filmed the video for it. With how precious time is, especially now that I'm starting grad school, this really applies to how I should go about deciding what videos to make. He also compares the difference between surprise and suspense in a movie. So he shares two examples. Both examples take place at a dinner table. In one example, there's a couple eating, there's a bomb under the table, and the bomb just blows up, and it's very surprising for the audience that are watching. However, the difference between that and suspense is in the scene where it's supposed to be suspenseful, the audience knows about the bomb under the table the entire time, and they're wondering, when is the bomb going to go off? Before he made Rebecca, he was going to actually make a movie on the Titanic. David O. Selznick was the producer of Rebecca in a lot of the movies that Hitchcock made early on in his career in America. But he wanted him to make a Titanic film, and then it just fell through and changed to Rebecca. So it's kind of interesting, though, to think of Hitchcock directing a Titanic film. I would imagine that there would be a lot of suspenseful scenes for one, but also I would just be curious to see what his final product would be, and I kind of wish that we still got it. I've read in a few places that Shadow of a Doubt was Alfred Hitchcock's favorite movie, and I've even mentioned that on previous videos of the channel, but on page 151, he actually says, I wouldn't say that Shadow of a Doubt is my favorite picture. If I've given that impression, it's probably because I feel that here is something that our friends, the plausibles and logicians, cannot complain about. And so he does appreciate it, he does like it, but he admits right there that it's not his favorite necessarily. A really interesting point that Hitchcock and Truffaut talk about is on page 191 concerning villains. Hitchcock says, the more successful the villain, the more successful the picture. I just think that's such an interesting observation, that the better the villain, the better the movie. And the more I think about it, the more I agree with it too. There's several funny parts in the book as well. One thing that I want to mention is when they're talking about the movie Suspicion with Cary Grant and Joan Fontaine. He's explaining the movie and how he made it and everything. And then out of nowhere, he's like, by the way, did you look at the scene with the glass of milk? When Cary Grant takes it upstairs, yes, it's very good. I put a light in it. I put a light in it. You mean a spotlight in it? No, I put a light inside a glass because I wanted it to look more luminous. For some reason, I like imagining that Alfred Hitchcock is just super excited about the fact that he put this light in the glass of milk. And it's an amazing technique to really put an emphasis on the milk, but I love how excited he gets in the interview, how he just like draws all attention to that scene. One thing that's super funny to me that Alfred Hitchcock used to do when he worked under Selznick is that he would shoot the one piece of film in such a way that no one else could put the pieces together properly except for him. The only way that they could be edited was to follow exactly what I had in mind in the shooting stages, which is hilarious because Hitchcock and Selznick didn't have a very good relationship. That is like, he won that round, let's just say that. Another really funny story about Alfred Hitchcock, I'm just gonna read this excerpt from page 299 real quick. It's a really funny story. Once we were at a party in a restaurant with some 12 guests to celebrate my wife's birthday. I hired an aristocratic-looking elderly dowager and we put her at the place of honor. Then I ignored her completely. The guests came in, and when they saw the nice old lady sitting alone at the big table, each one asked me, "Who's the old lady?" And then I answered, "I don't know." The waiters were in on the gag, and when anyone asked them, "But what did he say? Didn't anyone speak to her?" The waiter said, "The lady told us that she was a guest of Mr. Hitchcock's." And whenever I was asked about it, I maintained that I hadn't the slightest idea who she was. People were becoming increasingly curious. That's all I could think about. Then, when we were in the middle of our dinner, one writer suddenly banged his fist on the table and said, "It's a gag!" And while all the guests were looking at the old lady to see whether it was true, the writer turned to a young man who had been brought along by one of the guests and said, "I bet you're a gag too." And then he goes on to say how he would have liked to take the joke even further. He says, "I'd like to hire a woman of the type for a dinner and introduce her to the guests as an elderly aunt of mine." The so-called aunt would say, "Can I have a drink?" And in front of everyone, I would say, "Absolutely not. You know how you are when you drink. No drinks for you." So the old lady would wander off into a corner looking very pathetic. All the guests would be quite uncomfortable. Later on, Auntie would come over again with soulful eyes, and I would say very sharply, "It's no good looking at me like that. Besides, you're embarrassing everybody." And the old lady would simply whimper and then begin to cry softly while the guests wouldn't know where to look and really would feel they were in the way. And then I'd say, "Look here, you're ruining our whole party. That's enough. You better go back to your room." The only reason that I never pulled that joke is that I'm afraid someone might hit me. That is like so funny to me. It reminds me of something that would be in Drake and Josh. I think it actually was in Drake and Josh one episode. On page 308, he mentions The Twilight Zone, which really got me excited because Alfred Hitchcock is my favorite director. The Twilight Zone is my favorite TV show, and so putting the two together just gets me really giddy inside. There is so much more that I could talk about with Hitchcock Truffaut. I talked about a lot of my notes right here. However, there were excerpts I skipped just for times, things I highlighted that I didn't even mention. I guess that's my way of telling you guys to just read the book for yourselves. I bought it brand new off of Amazon. It was a little over $20. I think the price has gone up. However, I think it's worth buying a new copy because if you're wanting to mark it up and add your notes, then a new copy is the way to go. This book definitely gets a 5 out of 5 for me. Reading Alfred Hitchcock related books and incorporating that into my Hitchcock month was one of the best decisions I could have made for the month of August because last year I only watched movies, whereas this year I read 4 books relating to Hitchcock, and it made the experience that much more diverse and enjoyable. Not only was I watching what the director actually makes, but on the sideline I was reading about why he does what he does and how he's able to accomplish what he makes. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video, hearing my thoughts on these Alfred Hitchcock books. I have plenty of other Hitchcock books in the collection that I will read someday, but for now, those are the 4 I'm discussing. I hope you have a great rest of your day.